Pharisees and some scribes about the tradition of the elders, with Jesus redefining the purity code of the day and proclaiming that what actually matters is that which comes from the heart. And I guess it will come of no surprise, really, that I'm going to focus on the first part of our gospel reading about the Syrophoenician woman, although Proverbs is another really good reading. And to be fair, I did have to actually ask myself, and I'm doing this more and more, I wonder what the designers of the lectionary were actually thinking by placing these two healing pericopes together, because there's so much going on in the first one. So the account is enclosed between the arrival in and departure from the region of Tyre. And this geographical framing is suggested to define it as a separate and distinct unit of text. So what's in the location? Well, Tyre lies north of Galilee, so we know it as modern-day Lebanon. The use of Tahoria, is suggested to highlight that this represented and included farmlands and villages. It was an area of mixed ethnicity and also a site of economic tension, particularly between the wealthier city dwellers and the poorer farmers. During Roman occupation, the leaders of Phoenicia, the main city, were political pawns, extracting goods and services from southern regions occupied by Jewish communities. Now, we're not told directly why Jesus decided to head to this region, and we're not told anything about the house that he actually enters. But what we are told suggests that this was a trip of refuge rather than mission. And once more, his attempt to retreat fails. Enter the woman, who'd heard about him and whose daughter is possessed with an unclean spirit. Now her approach parallels that of Jairus, as she bows down at Jesus' feet in her plea for exorcism on her absent daughter's behalf. Now, unlike the author of Matthew in the account, who refers to this woman using the antiquated biblical name Canaanite, the author of Mark takes care to characterize this woman as Hellenes, which means Greek woman, yet is translated as Gentile. So she's Greek and Syrophoenician. And in this careful characterization, we hear that this woman is well and truly an outsider by gender, culture, religion, and ethnicity. And we also hear her desperation as she begs for her daughter to be liberated. So the fact that this woman is such an outsider in need of Jesus' help, surely we're left a bit challenged and perplexed by Jesus' rude and seemingly uncharacteristic hostile response as he refers to the woman as a dog. Now, some people like to interpret Jesus' response with the suggestion that he was simply having a joke with the woman. We can't possibly have Jesus behaving in such a manner. Now, I've never approached this text thinking that Jesus was joking, but I have approached this text suggesting that Jesus was ultimately a first century Jewish man, and was aware of his own racial identity, and that in his humanness he had absorbed the racism and sexism inherent in his context. And some people don't like that. Now, the contemptible term, dogs, is generally understood to be a term used by Jews about Gentiles. But is it? Well, apparently, there is no evidence to support this. Now, this is what I've been told over the years as well, but apparently there's no evidence to support this. So what I did come across was the understanding that this was a term used to refer to groups of people who were hostile to God's people and to God's law. And this led me to another possible interpretation to help us understand Jesus' quite hostile outburst. It suggested that the geographical location and the way in which the author introduces this woman's identity so specifically sets the scene. All of this identifies her not just as a Gentile, but very possibly this woman was one of the city dwellers. Part of the group whose policies and lifestyle led to the suffering of the poorer, rural Jewish neighbours. Nicaraguan peasants in the Gospel of Sol and Timony reached the conclusion that this woman must have been wealthy and must have been an oppressor, and this is based purely on Jesus' response. If this is the case, the woman's behaviour would have certainly have been viewed as hostile to the divine mandate of justice. And so basically, the harsh confrontation is related to the woman's unjust economic advantage and potential oppression of God's people. I hope you all got that. It'll be online later. The woman refuses to accept Jesus' rejection. She stands confident in her own sense of power and employs a little bit of wit as she transforms a label of contempt into an image reflecting a more domestic scene. She relinquishes her place of privilege and moves to a place willing to receive whatever's left over. This retort, this woman's courage, results in the exorcism being carried out. Jesus is transformed. And I guess the idea of Jesus changing can be challenging to many. How can Jesus be changed? He's divine. He's without sin. Does this make him a sinner? And this is why often people try and rescue Jesus with, he was just joking. Well, one question I came across in my readings was, are we so constrained by our traditional readings of the New Testament documents and the Council of Nicaea, etc., that we are unable to experience the profound? Last week, Jesus proclaimed that it was what comes from the heart that renders someone unclean. Are we so conditioned that we're unable to hear or accept that this woman was able to transform the heart of Jesus, bringing him more in line with God? Is it possible that this woman affirms and convinces Jesus that the bounds of his ministry is to extend beyond the children of Israel to all people, even the wealthy? Because it seems that Jesus is trapped by his characterization of her as enemy, rather than being able to see a woman who desperately seeks liberation for a daughter. We're coming close to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. That horrific day that saw thousands of people killed in the name of God. And I guess to some degree, in the name of purity codes. And they were held by people of extreme religious views. Just on Friday, New Zealand experienced a terror attack, and it cost people their lives. This attack, carried out by a person identified as holding violent ideology and inspired by ISIS. Now you might be thinking, oh, she got to hear. Well, like Jesus, we look at situations from a particular perspective, through a particular lens. And incidents like this has, for as long as I can remember, tended to unleash hateful speech and actions against whole groups of people. As Jesus saw a woman of privilege and insulted her, so too will some people of other faiths respond in harsh and hurtful ways. We've all heard the saying, and it's quite a violent saying, of tar with the same brush. As the situation in Afghanistan continues to unfold, we're going to see so many people desperately seeking refuge. And we've heard it said already that those who arrive by boat will not be allowed to remain on our shores. And I wonder, are we so constrained by the belief that people can simply hop on a plane to seek refuge and safety? Are we going to allow the rhetoric of fear to roam free with the assumption that the Taliban will breach our borders? I confess that I am fearful that hate will begin to bubble up again in our communities against our Muslim siblings. Religion and culture are important to individual and communal identity. And one of the biggest challenges we face is the hate that festers, the violence that arises. And let's not deny that this happens in the Christian faith too. In many ways, the Church views herself as the sole repository of religious truth. And for many people, there is no way that they are going to pollute their faith by exploring or accepting another. What does that reveal about our hearts? Brian Hebblethwaite, a philosophical theologian, is cited as suggesting Christians must cease to think of their own faith as bearing witness to God's final and absolute self-revelation to humanity. God is bigger than any one theology. As for faith, it calls us to freedom from fear, calls us to love, calls us to the vision of the kingdom, which is a vision of inclusion. Events like 9/11, like the takeover of Afghanistan after a long period of war, like the terror attack in New Zealand, become part of our collective memory. And the challenge to every person is the call to respect diversity. For all of us who proclaim a Christian faith, the challenge is to remember that the gospel message is one of inclusion. To remember that Jesus' ministry extended beyond the bounds of the children of Israel. Today, in our reading, a woman, an outsider in so many ways, rejects the discrimination based on her gender, ethnicity, religious affiliation, and social status. She makes no claim of faith. Jesus makes no comment of forgiveness. She stands firm in her worth, not her privilege, and claims her inclusion within the circle of those touched by Jesus. This woman transformed Jesus. She reminds him that God is divine mystery. God is love. And that love is not bound by purity codes, tradition, rules. God's love is for all. We are challenged to consider what we need to relinquish. Because if we fail to respect diversity, we fail to respect the dignity of humanity. And we fail to recognise that inclusion is the cornerstone of the new social order, the cornerstone of the kingdom. Let's pray. Elohim, Yahweh, Shekinah, El Roi. Many are your names, O God. May we remember that we are created in your image, uniquely and diversely, not the other way around. Send your Spirit upon us. May she grant us wisdom to speak truth and relinquish all that prevents inclusive love. In the name of the one who transforms and was transformed. Amen.